We don't really understand what the role of fire is in the desert. We just know that it didn't burn very often. It's a young system. We know fire didn't burn very often, and yet in the last 3 years, about 20 to 25% of the Sonoran Desert on the Tonto National Forest has burned. Most of that due to invasive grasses. My name is Mary Latta. I am the fire ecologist for the Tonto National Forest in Arizona. When we're trying to figure out what the fire regime might be for an ecosystem, one of the things you look at is how old does a plant need to be to reproduce. So the saguaro, which is the best known plant certainly in the Sonoran Desert, it needs to be at least, say, 30 years old before it can reproduce. So that tells me that fire could not have occurred any more often than 30 years. Fire in the Sonoran Desert generally has two different sources of ignition. One is lightning, of course, but the far larger one is humans. We're standing along Highway 87 on the Tonto National Forest. The area behind me has burned twice in the last 20 years. So these are forbs and native annual grasses. This hillside in front of me here, you can see that all of the shrubs are pretty young. Again, they're only about 3 years old, most of them. And the hills further to the north there, you can see the density that the desert should have in terms of the shrubs and the saguaro if it doesn't burn. So this is a big Palo Verde, or it used to be. I've had a lot of people tell me that, oh, things don't sprout in the desert, it just kills them. That's not true. This Palo Verde, for example, is sprouting pretty vigorously. This just burned 2 years ago. When we get fires like the Woodbury fire, like the bush fire, like the telegraph fire, that get up and move really fast through invasive grasses, they shoot up into the chaparral. Chaparral likes to burn with high severity, once, probably no more often than about every 35 years or so, but when it burns, it likes to burn to the ground. And when that goes flying up into ponderosa pine, it's going to take out a lot of the pine, and we've been seeing a lot of that too. Ponderosa pine is well adapted to fire, and it needs fire, but it needs the right kind of fire. The same is true for the grasslands, the same is true for the chaparral, the same is true for all of the systems that we know about on the Tonto, except for some of our riparian areas down in the desert and the desert. Those are areas where we don't understand the role of fire yet.
So we're standing here at the confluence between Mesquite Wash and Sycamore Creek, and behind me upstream on Mesquite Wash is where the bushfire burned in 2020. My name is Kelly Mott-Lacroix. I'm the forest hydrologist and Burned Area Emergency Response Bear Forest Coordinator on the Tonto National Forest. So if the area around us burns at most every 30 to 40 years, more likely something in the 200 to 500 year range, the riparian area would burn even less than that because of the moisture that's within it. Riparian areas are a really important part of the desert ecosystem. And when we have fire that burns through those systems, if they're healthy, like the one that you see here behind me that has water flowing and moist soils, they can actually serve as a barrier to fires. As we see the climate change, as we see more drought, you start to see the riparian areas having less water, and when they have less water, they are less resistant to fire. One of the important things to remember about riparian areas is they are fundamentally a system that has a lot of change all the time. They are not static. And a lot of what creates that change are the floods that come through. And fire can be just another one of those changes that comes through a desert riparian area. And the floods that come after the fires can also be an opportunity for the riparian area to reset itself. So fire and floods in riparian areas are not necessarily a bad thing. But what we want is a riparian area that has enough moisture so that it can support itself through fire and through the floods afterwards, so that that area that's cleared out when you get a flood or you get a fire that comes through can be a space for regeneration. One of the areas for research that we need to better understand is what are those thresholds? What are those points at which a riparian area gets too dry to be able to survive and come back after a fire comes through?
I've been working on and off in the Sonoran Desert since the late 90s, And the changes are really dramatic. It's possible to see the spread of many invasive grasses. You can look up on hillsides outside of Phoenix and Tucson, and they've really changed in color due to the presence of those grasses. And now, just in the last few years, we are seeing a real extension of the fire risk. My name is Claire Aslan. I'm the co-director for the Center for Adaptable Western Landscapes at Northern Arizona University. One of the projects that I'm leading is an attempt to examine pollinator recovery in sites that have burned, and particularly sites that have burned at different levels of severity. We think that perhaps in areas of low severity, enough native plants might be able to recover, that the native pollinators will have access to the food items that they require and access to the nesting sites that they require. But in areas with medium and high severity, often it seems the vegetation is shifting to a grassland-dominated state, and grasses do not provide food for pollinators, and in that type of an environment, we think access to nesting resources is also very limited. Our hope, once we understand which species are recovering, and in particular how they're recovering, whether it's because they have access to the right types of forage plants or because they have access to the right types of nesting materials, is to be able to then enhance those resources elsewhere across the desert, perhaps through methods like restoration. For those species that are not recovering, whether that's plants or the pollinators that serve them, our interest is in understanding whether there's any opportunity to reintroduce those species, or perhaps for other species to serve the same functional role in a post-fire ecosystem. We're obviously still learning a lot about these systems, and there's a great deal we still need to learn, so the research is active and ongoing. But in the end, our hope is to apply that work and that knowledge in conservation and ways to try to restore these ecosystems. So our primary goal is to be able to guide efforts by land managers and by other entities to try to either bring back or maintain the native biodiversity in these sites. For now, it's important for us to be trialing and considering methods of restoration, understanding what those limitations might be, what the greatest challenges are, and doing our best to preserve the areas that still remain as native and biodiverse ecosystems.
We don't really know what climate change is going to do to this area, but we know we have these invasive grasses and they are not going away. So the desert is turning into what I'm calling a shrub and grass driven fire regime, meaning it's going to burn frequently, more often than probably every 30 to 35 years, but that doesn't mean it's a grassland. A grassland would have to have enough perennial precipitation to support perennial grasses. So in the end, we don't know where this system is going. We don't know what the ecological trajectory of the Sonoran Desert is. We know it's been severely destabilized by the presence of these non-native grasses. We don't really know what the role of fire is, but we see it being fairly destructive when it can burn through contiguous fine surface fuels as often as it has been in the recent years. So we're working right now to try and get a better handle on the ecological trajectory of the Sonoran Desert. We need to identify management actions that are going to be sustainable for the ecological future of the Sonoran Desert.